Welcome to the Whose Body Is It podcast. I'm your host, Isabella Malvin. For those who don't know me, I'm a birth worker, a life coach, hypnotist, and a former liberal feminist turned radical truth teller. On this podcast, I expose the forces at play attempting to control our minds and bodies, such as transgender ideology, pornography, prostitution, and so much more. Together, we'll untangle patriarchal lies as you listen to jaw-dropping interviews with women from around the world. Warning, while listening to this podcast, you might find yourself triggered or perhaps notice where you've been biting your tongue on the issues that matter most to you. In my coaching and hypnosis, I help women and men stop getting triggered by every single thing, cultivate resilience, stop unwanted behaviors, and increase self-confidence. You can book your first session at whosebodyisit.com, and you can find that link in the episode show notes. And I just want to say that it's because of your endless support that I'm able to interview amazing women, get their stories out, and produce regular episodes for you. So with that being said, please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel on YouTube. And if you're listening in, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And also consider making a financial contribution via the link in my show notes. You can also visit my activist sticker shop. My pro-woman stickers have the power to intercept transhumanist programming. So take a photo of your stickers out in the wild and tag me on Instagram at Whose Body Is It. Without further ado, let's get into this week's story. Kristin Hauser joins us today to talk about cultivating female fertility outside of the medical model. She's been working in the fertility space for over 10 years as an acupuncturist and sex and relationship coach. Kristen has seen all manner of fertility issues, from women later in their fertile years who've been working to the point of burnout, to the less talked about younger women whose cycles were damaged by years of hormonal birth control. Interventions such as intrauterine insemination, IVF, to surrogacy are all touted by the fertility industry as the best path to motherhood if you don't conceive within a few months of trying. As an acupuncturist, Kristen tried to serve women within this model, but soon realized it was out of integrity for her. She encourages women and men to consider their fertility as an extension of creativity, of their physical and spiritual well-being, and she uses a variety of methods that never require invasive testing or surgery. In this episode, Kristen discusses fertility struggles as a catalyst for sexual reawakening and how, staying out of the mainstream medical model, women can come into motherhood in their power. Kristen's upcoming class, Restoring Your Fertility and Ovarian Vitality, on August 5th is a great place to start for women who want to truly understand their bodies and improve their fertility with ease and without medical intervention. You can learn more about Kristen's upcoming class in the episode show notes. Kristen, thank you so much for joining me. I want to hear, I'm so excited to hear all about your work, especially, on my podcast, I'm talking a lot about like dark, terrible things a lot of the time. And I like that you're on the kind of the what's next, or like, where do we go from here? You're offering kind of resolutions for women. So would you mind just starting off introducing yourself and telling my audience a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Yeah. So thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and have this conversation with you. I'm Kristin Hauser. I'm a mother of 3. I've been in the fertility space for a while, probably 10 years or a little bit longer. By training, I'm an acupuncturist and herbalist and somatic sex educator. I also, prior to that, when I was still in school studying Chinese medicine, I worked as a doula, like a birth doula, totally in the system, attending hospital births and some outside of hospital births as well. And before that, I was teaching yoga specifically for women. So my background is kind of varied, but fertility specific, I've been in that space for the last 10 years. And as I got into it was kind of through fertility acupuncture. So supporting women who were choosing ART, which is assisted reproductive technology, and also helping and supporting women who were trying to get pregnant outside of that model. So over the years, my work has kind of shifted to be more working with women who are wanting to conceive completely away from reproductive technology. And that's for a variety of reasons, partly because I find it more fulfilling, but also because of what I saw within the reproductive technology industry. And so many women who came through my practice, especially in those earlier years when I was first starting out. And I was just seeing how traumatized they were by that entire process of kind of having their bodies looked at so mechanistically and having so many pelvic exams and different procedures, testing. And then they're trying to conceive. And it was just a total mismatch around how their physiology is sort of designed to work and like what they were actually going through during that process. So, of course, yes, sometimes ART does works, and we have to consider like what is an actual positive outcome. So that's what I'm more interested in is like, well, is a positive outcome just a pregnancy, like a viable pregnancy, or is it like a mother who is thriving and in conscious choice around her process of becoming pregnant and then through the pregnancy? Because even within the reproductive technology space, like if you conceive through IVF or something, you're so under like this particular model of care where you may be receiving transvaginal ultrasounds weekly in the very beginning of your pregnancy, which is like a whole nother thing we can get into, but that's like a little bit about me and what I do now. So yeah, I've had like a fertility acupuncture practice. I'm not doing that right now. I have a young baby. He's 10 months old. So right now my work is primarily online and working with women virtually through consultations around complex fertility challenges or more simple stuff as well. And then other areas of womb health that sort of spans fertility through postpartum.
Have you seen, like, what have you seen in terms of the demographic that you support? Do you find that you work with women who are later into their reproductive lifespan? Do you get women who are more interested in ART if you know what they do with you doesn't work? Like in the years that you've been in practice, have you seen an increase in women wanting to use ART or and also like an older demographic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question because, again, it's like such a variety of what I've seen over the last 10 years or so. I think, yes, women are trying to conceive or calling in conception later in life, and that can come with not just physiological challenges, which I don't think that's always accurate, but it's almost like they have been living their life in a very particular way and in a very particular world. And sometimes there's a mismatch in what's actually needed to slow down and orient to becoming a mother. And they are sort of viewing getting pregnant with the same lens of which they've lived their life in other ways. So this is very stereotypical, but it's like lawyers often are in this category of like women who have really worked on their career for several years. And then they're switching and thinking like, oh my gosh, now I want to get pregnant. And they're kind of using the same model that they've approached their career to approach fertility. So that happens. But really, there's a spectrum because I've also worked with women who are like 25 and were on birth control for a very long time. And then when they stop birth control, they never get their cycle back. And they kind of enter into this like weird menopausal type of hormonal pattern, but it's not true menopause. So I've seen that. I've seen women who have no interest in ART, but feel like it's their only viable option because that's what the society and culture is telling them is that, oh, if you have fertility problems, then you need to go and like IVF is the solution. So I've seen that, but I've also seen like women who are not into holistic health at all, but like because ART hasn't worked for them, they're like, well, okay, this model is not working. I'm also kind of traumatized from it. Now what? Like, what am I going to do next? And that's a really interesting place to be in, because some of those women go through like a whole awakening process around the power of their sexuality, how they can actually come into motherhood in a more integral way, and how they can repair from some of the medical trauma that they carry in the pelvic space specifically. And I think it's important to note that like most of my practice, I was living in California. I don't live in California now, but surrogacy laws in California are, very particular, and it's a very common practice there. So even some of the women that I work with would go from, IUI to IVF, and then the doctor's like, well, you need to consider using an egg donor, or you need to consider surrogacy. And this has been so normalized in that particular culture that women do kind of buy into it, and they think it's like an okay thing to do. So yeah, there's a big variety of what I've seen in the last several years.
It's interesting that the part you mentioned about women having like sexual awakenings when the medicalization of their reproductive capacity doesn't work out. I was just informed by a guest named March, who told her story of all the false promises of IVF and surrogacy. And one thing she mentioned that I hadn't considered was that during the IVF process, she said she and her husband were actually encouraged not to have sex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there can sometimes the doctors have concerns around like latent infections, or that they're going to, disrupt the process in some way. So yeah, that's a really common practice. It becomes totally medicalized with IVF specifically. With IUI, sometimes they'll encourage you to still have sex like just regularly if it's a heterosexual couple. But with IVF, they get very detail oriented, and there's just protocols. Each doctor, like I've worked with a lot of different reproductive endocrinologists, and each doctor kind of has their particular things that they like to implement and emphasize. So it's very interesting. It's like a very interesting industry to be exposed to, like kind of on the inside. Of course, I'd never worked in a reproductive endocrinologist office or anything like that, but I have interfaced with them like in attending IVF transfers, where I would provide acupuncture for the woman before and after. And it's just like, it's such an interesting environment to consider the process of becoming a mother or family.
Because I've spoken to a couple traditional Chinese medicine practitioners who now will vet their client, like they won't work with women who are going through IVF and assisted reproductive technologies, because the cases are so complicated, and there's like the like emotional, spiritual kind of like disconnect and dissociation. So yeah, it's interesting that you're still kind of interfacing and playing a role to some degree. And it also just highlights.
Well, I'm not anymore.
Sorry, you're not anymore.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're not
I'm
anymore.
not anymore, but I have in the past.
That you
So
have in the past. Oh, okay.
yeah.
So then why, could you talk a little bit about why you stopped?
Yeah. So it just wasn't in integrity or alignment for me to continue working in that model, essentially. I think women should be able to make their reproductive choices. And if that's what they want to do, then they should pursue that. And for me, I don't feel like I can be useful or can be supportive of that particular constellation and that approach to the body and to conception in general. So now I work more with women who are in alignment with that and are like, look, I'm having trouble. I'm not conceiving. Something is off. I'm maybe interested in doing some testing, like blood testing or urine testing, like hormone testing that's outside of a medical office, and not super invasive. And they want to conceive like at home without intervention.
It wasn't really until the last year that it dawned on me that this is the same, like that I had kind of separated these categories of women who would do third party reproduction, women who wouldn't. And that they were going to be going to different doctors and different practitioners. And then it was a fertility awareness educator friend of mine who was like, a lot of women come to me, they want to learn how to chart their cycle, they don't get anywhere, they don't get pregnant, and off they go to the ART path. And then I was like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, this is so, I mean,
Yeah.
it's so, yeah, like I said, I'm embarrassed to admit that it just like dawned on me in the past year. Um, but that, and this is part of the reason why I'm hosting this class with Jennifer Law, because I want all practitioners to have this information, the language to talk about the ethics, the legal ethics, the medical ethics, and then but someone like you has all of the physiological kind of explanation and understanding in a whole nother capacity of what happens when a body is going through this, and also the spiritual element of the yeah, the abrasiveness, the brutality of some of these treatments, compared to the more integrative, holistic models that you kind of you describe, that are like the backbone of what you do.
Yeah. And I don't want to give like the preconceived notion, like I'm not necessarily saying that my methodology or taking a holistic approach will work in every circumstance. And then the question becomes like at a more spiritual level of like, what is fertility really about? And that's like something that one of my teachers, Randine Lewis, who's a kind of elder Chinese medicine practitioner, and she wrote a book called The Fertile Soul. And she discusses in that it's like, you can have a baby, but still feel in your spirit and like in your physiology that you're not fertile, that you're still identifying with infertility in that way. And that does happen to women who go through ART. It's like they're still so identified with being their body being broken in quotation marks, or that they're unable to do this basic physiological function. So I think then you have to kind of get into the more spiritual side of things as to what that means for that particular woman on her particular journey, or that particular family. Because also, this is like a whole nother side of it, is that fertility issues are half on men, right? It's not just women that we're speaking to here. And so I won't work with someone really if they've said they've been, they're in a heterosexual relationship and they've been having fertility challenges, or they've been trying to conceive for X amount of months. Let's just say it's about 6 months to a year, and something's not working. Then I want to know what's going on with the man, because that is equally important. So a lot of times as women, we will overtake responsibility in the fertility journey or process. And so I'm always really working with women around like, what is actually your part and what is your male partner, if you are with a male partner, because I work with same-sex couples too. So what is that piece of the puzzle? Because there's got to be something there too. So yeah, there's a lot that goes into it when you're considering like what your options are. But I think because culturally it's been so normalized, like the whole ART, even though it's been around, I think since the 1970s, but it's become so normalized that some people just think like when you want to get pregnant, like that's what you do.
Right.
That you just like, if it doesn't work within a few months, you go and get ART.
Mm-hmm.
You go to like the reproductive specialist,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
I think is so like, that's what really gets me, is like some women find me and they're like, oh, I just didn't know. Like, I just thought I didn't get pregnant for 3 months. And then I went, and I'm like, well, that's not that long. And there's so many factors at play, like just going straight to spending 15 plus $1,000. It's not really that logical in my worldview and like framework. So yeah, we're living in a very interesting time when it comes to reproduction and reproductive technology, and like where it has the potential to go in terms of human reproduction is it causes me to pause and like think like, where are we taking this? Like, what's the end goal?
Right. Like, how would you determine post fertility versus infertility, and how do you navigate women on the older and
Like,
coming to you?
yeah,
Yeah. Can you talk about
40
that?
plus or 45 plus. I mean, I'm honest with women in regards to that. So I'll always look at cycle parameters and see like, okay, if you're cycling regularly and you're noticing fertile cervical fluid and you're tracking your basal body temperature and it is increasing and you're having sustained increase in basal body temperature for at least 10 days. So those are like the baseline parameters that I look at. And then of course, taking into consideration, like, are you having any other hormonal symptoms? Do you have previous pregnancies? So that has to come into play too. And then if it's still not coming together or something's still feeling off, then we might do some testing, just like I really like the Dutch test. It's a complete hormone test that's through urine. You do it at home, you send it in, and it can show your adrenal hormones and your progesterone and your estrogen and how you metabolize your estrogen, your testosterone, like so many different things. And so then I would look at that. And I might also look at FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, which tends to increase as we age because our ovaries don't respond as quickly. And with all of that said, at the same time, like, I do believe that there are situations where things can look off on paper and someone can still get pregnant, or things can look great on paper and someone's still struggling. So we have to take that into consideration. And I just try to be honest with women and also help them to understand that ART is not necessarily going to give them better chances. Like, it could actually hurt them more. So that is like a very interesting conversation to have with women, because then I kind of need to explain how reproductive technology works and what happens at the level of like how the brain is communicating with the ovaries, what's going on with estrogen production, how having so much estrogen in your system could be problematic, because, you know, when you go through the IVF process, you're trying to ripen as many eggs as possible, right? Without tipping you into like OHSS, which is like ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So it's like that weird place of they're trying to get all these eggs to ripen at the same time, but that doesn't mean that any of them are going to be viable.
Right.
Because we're sending so much, getting so much estrogen in the system, and that's going to shift like the microcirculation to the ovaries and also the micronutrient density and even mitochondrial function of the cells that are in that ovum or are part of that follicle constellation. So it gets complex, and it's hard for women to understand that this very mechanistic yang type of masculine approach to reproduction doesn't necessarily produce the result that is anticipated or desired, right? So sometimes we really have to shift away from that mindset. And so like one example that's coming to mind is I worked with a woman, this was like earlier on in my practice, and she was very like just such a sweet woman to work with. And she was in her early 40s and had been a lawyer, you know, working for the last 15 years, like very busy, very stressed, and wanted to conceive and it wasn't working. Obviously, that's why she was working with me. And so she was going the ART model, and she was like doing the IUIs and taking the Clomid, and then, okay, that didn't work. Okay, we're going to do IVF. Okay, IVF's not working. She's not responding the way we anticipated. Okay, we're going to, you know, what's next? And so she was really distraught about all of this. And what we ended up doing was I was like, look, you've got to change directions. Like, you've got to really go a different way. This is not working for your body. Like the drugs and you know, then she was having cycle issues because of all the medication she'd been on. So we took a pause, and she just like worked on some lifestyle factors and was taking Chinese herbs like really consistently. And then she was able to get pregnant, like completely away from that model, and like has a baby now and all of that. So it's just really interesting from my point of view, like the cases that I see and like the success that I see. And I'm like, why are we still like so many women still invested in that? That's the question I ask myself is just the medical indoctrination is so strong. It's like really hard to come up against.
Yeah, I wonder if I think it must be the heavy indoctrination. Then also they're already feeling like if you already have the illusion that it's going to work, and you also believe that you're running out of time. I feel like from what I've heard about the consultations with these endocrinologists or gynecologists, obstetricians, fertility specialists at the clinics, it's always kind of like, yeah, you could try it. Yeah, you could see how it goes, blah, blah. But like these people don't actually know what basal body temperature, like they don't actually know even how to teach fertility awareness method, let alone deal with the complexity of the women that are, coming to you and have your knowledge base, and I mean, these people generally aren't even recommending diet shifts. So I feel like the attitude from what I've heard about these meetings, these consultations that women are having is like, you can try it, but you're already on the older end. And so
Mhm.
you're kind of like, you might be wasting time.
Yeah, that's a common narrative or kind of like pain point for, I think, for the reproductive endocrinologist specifically, just saying like, after 35, your chances go down. Then after 4, it's like always about the age, the number age, and not really looking at like, well, what's actually going on. And, someone who's 40 and already had 2 pregnancies and, has a very different fertility outlook than someone who's 40 and been under a high amount of stress for the last 15 years and is now like totally trying to shift into a physiology that supports conception. Like those are 2 very different situations. So I think kind of the lack of individualized care is a big problem. And with that said, like I have met some reproductive endocrinologists, mostly females, women, who are really caring and they do believe in the work they're doing, and they probably have their own ART story, right? They probably have their own process that they went through, and now they want to help other women become mothers using this technology. And sometimes they have a little bit more of an individualized approach and that sort of thing, and that can be helpful. But a lot of times, like part of the work I did when I was doing more consultations with women who were going through IUI and IVF was like, look, the reproductive endocrinologist, like it's not necessarily going to be the best experience. You're going to maybe feel like a number, like you're just kind of moving through the motions. You're going to have to really advocate for yourself. So it was a lot of that kind of
Mm.
model, kind of like what I did in the doula system as well, where it's like, you've got to do this and you've got to stand up for yourself. And I just don't want to participate in that at all anymore. And that was like so normalized because the reproductive specialists aren't even necessarily explaining what they're doing, right? They are just like, okay, here's the drugs, here's the protocol, read this sheet, do these things, come in for these appointments. And it's very, very overwhelming for a woman, especially the first time she's like entering into it. Um, and there is a level of disassociation, I think, that often happens because how could you not in that situation, right? How could you not? You're getting transvaginal ultrasound. You need to get an HSG, which is like when they inject the fluid and the dye into the fallopian tubes, and maybe you're doing an endometrial biopsy before the IVF transfer. Like there's just it's like one thing after another. Plus you're doing injectable hormones often if you're going through IVF. So then you're doing injectable hormones on yourself, or you're teaching your partner how to do them. It's just like it's too much. It's too much too fast. Like it is a process that lends itself to a traumatic response. So the way that the system functions, it's hard. Even when I was like advocating, helping women advocate for themselves, it's like it doesn't make sense. It really just, it doesn't work. Similar to birthing in the hospital environment and sort of bringing a doula with you and thinking that the doula is going to be there to help stop anything bad from happening. No, it doesn't work. It's just the model is set up the way it is, and you can either actively choose to participate in it, knowing what you're getting, or you can choose to not participate in it. Those are kind of that's the way I frame it, is like, you can choose to go into that model, and you need to choose to go into it with your eyes open, understanding how that model functions and what you're actually receiving. And I think that's the disconnect for a lot of women, is they don't really know what it is they're getting into, because it's just like, you go in for the consultation. Usually there's an initial fee. The doctor might look over labs or recommend labs, and then kind of get you into the testing stage of things. Because even before you can pursue treatment, there's often several certain tests that you have to go through. Some of that's blood testing, some of that's ultrasound, usually an HSG, which is like the dye inserted in the uterus and fallopian tubes to see if there's any blockages. And after all of that, then you get kind of to discuss like, what are the treatment protocols that are available. Very particular way of doing things.
Yeah. Yeah, the question you posed earlier of like, why do women still do this, or why are women so easily going down this route? And maybe one explanation would be, well, just because it's like such a primal desire, and it is so devastating to realize like it's like too late, or that you're too sick, or fill in the blank. And then also it reminds me of something that a psychologist I interviewed named Dr. Amanda Savage Brown, who talked about like the reasonings why women get breast implants, even after being told like the risks. You could sit down and you can kind of theorize informed consent, but she described it, she called it the appetitive effect, where you're only focused on what you're going to get. And so someone might say, you have a 70% chance of death, and the woman hearing that might hear, oh, I have a 30% chance at life, so I'm wondering if that they're hearing the stats, like it could be very well that these doctors are, maybe some of them are transparent about the efficacy and like the success rate, but I more hear stories of like this woman, March, who I interviewed about her IVF and surrogacy like fails, described the doctors saying things like, we really think this is the one, or like the embryos look so good, they're so perfect, they're so healthy, and then like just the building the momentum to like keep trying. And what's another cycle? You've already come this far, like another cycle, maybe this one will be the one. That appetite of desire, that angle of wanting the child. And then she also described walking into the fertility clinic offices, and with all the happy smiling babies on the wall, with their parents. So it's like exploiting the most primal desire that we have, which is to procreate, and matched with an industry who is the only one that benefits at the end. I mean, you talked about, what do we consider, determining what we consider, any one woman considers a good outcome. Is that just getting pregnant? Is that, having a child with no health issues? Is that, like with the IVF kids, like we don't even know their lifespan. Like the oldest IVF kids are like 45. Like we can't even say they have this like a normal life expectancy, right? Like it's crazy. So I think, I want to hear more about those conversations you have with women, or, about, or what you think would be justifiable of the kind of the good outcome.
Yeah. I mean, I think everyone has to decide on that for themselves. But for me, it's like, it is a woman who goes through her conception and pregnancy and birthing process in an intact way. So in having a sense of agency over the process, not feeling like her body is medicalized or viewed through a very mechanistic lens. And of course, every mother wants a healthy baby. Every mother wants to have a baby that's thriving when it's born and is not born with an increased risk of allergies and asthma and all the things that are actually, we do have research and data to back up that IVF pregnancies do come with certain risks in regards to the life of the child. So in regards to the health and vitality of that child, which makes sense when you think about how conception takes place and everything that we maybe don't know or understand about conception. Right? It's very odd for me to consider that someone thinks conception that happens in a lab is of the same vitality and potency as conception that happens in a body, right? In a female body. So that, yeah. And a lot of the times the embryos are frozen before they're transferred, they're tested. So they have genetic material removed from them. So there's just so many factors that need to be considered. And I think that's where sometimes women start to think about it more in a spiritual way of like, does this really align with my spiritual belief system or whatever that is? Because I work, there's a wide variety of women that have different beliefs, religions, not non-religious spiritual beliefs, all of the above. But at some point, I think if you really feel into it in an embodied way, like a lot of times women will just be like, something, it doesn't feel right, or it feels something is off. And that's kind of the entry point possibly for some of them around aligning more with their own personal values to make a choice that works for them. And I do think, like, Isabella, you're talking about that primal desire, and that is so powerful that it can sort of drive you in a certain direction. And, sometimes there's really no stopping that. So there are, certain women that I worked with where it's like, I know, like, they're on a certain trajectory and they're not getting off of that. Like, that is their path. And that's okay. I have my boundaries around that. But from the lens of the industry model, it is kind of an exploitation of that, especially because this is changing right now, but a lot of this is not covered by insurance. So women are investing their life savings or asking for a loan or, of course, women and men, so couples often. So yeah, it's a very interesting process to think about, like, okay, this is how we're going to invest our resources and our time and our life force energy, because that's a big part of it too. It's like when you choose to interface with ART, there are different layers and levels to that, of course. Like doing an IUI is lower intervention than going through multiple rounds of IVF, but you are consciously choosing to put your life force energy into that. And it does cost, there is a big cost to go through an IVF stimulation round where you maybe get 15 eggs. That is going to impact you hormonally for many years after that. And I think that is where there's like not a lot of long-term vision around how these drugs can impact you. For example, I have like, this is actually just a friend of mine who is married to a woman, and they both have gone through IVF. And she's like, after that, I just wish I would have known the possible side effects or the possible repercussions, because she feels hormonally she's not been the same since that point. And so, of course, the doctor would say, no, that's not possible. After you go through IVF, like, you should return to normal and all of that. But she kind of has this knowing that she's had to work on her hormones and her hormonal health a lot more since going through IVF.
That seems like the best case scenario, to just have to work on, rather than it be like result in, breast cancer or hysterectomy, or like those are the stories that I've heard. I mean, when I was a doula in New York City, I think probably like a fourth of my clients conceived with IVF. One of them was a surrogate for her husband's sperm and an egg donor, the age of 48. So I had a lot of different like scenario. Like I also just in the capacity of a doula served a lot of women who had used ART, and they were the first ones to tell me like that it's complicated. Like, it is psychologically complicated. Like, I didn't work with a single woman who was like, IVF is amazing, it's perfect, I love it. It was so easy, thank God. Like, certainly they were holding that, like, they were glad they were pregnant, but the women that I served were very transparent about me about the ethics and like what to do with the frozen embryos. And like,
Mm-hmm.
I also observed, like as you kind of touched on, it was like a high medicalization in the pregnancy, and the birth, and then also postpartum. Like, there was this, I think it's unconscious, like, I shouldn't be pregnant. Like, that would be my projection. Like, there's this unconscious, like, this is dangerous. It's risky. I need more
Mm-hmm.
surveillance and
Yeah.
there's a case to be made why they would need more surveillance to like get them to the finish line, because they're literally like some of them having to take steroids to keep, the baby in like a foreign organ. like after an organ transplant. So yeah, where was I going with that? Oh yeah, so the complicated nature of yeah, the psychological like underpinnings. You mentioned it becoming more like there being more coverage available, and I think that's because of it's now falling under the like LGBT inclusivity, equity kind of
Mm-hmm.
propaganda. That's what March talked about in our episode, and that's what I've also just observed with like more bills being passed in California specifically, covering ART and surrogacy as well. And you know, it's so it's so I feel like we need different strategies when we're talking to women about the risks and the ethics and like the possible health repercussions versus men, because men who are using ART and surrogacy like aren't dealing with health risks. Like they're not.
Right. Yeah.
They're the it's a non-issue. So like the conversation needs to be more around like exploitation, like the industry.
Yeah.
Whereas with women, it's a bit more complicated. I mean, it's complicated because like as March talked about and we've talked about here today, some women are willing to overlook
Mm-hmm.
the complete destruction of their health to get the baby. And so
Yeah.
how do we talk to women about that, while holding that, they have this primal, the thing that they want isn't necessarily the problem. It's the way they're willing to get it and the people it
Well,
can
I
hurt
think,
along the way.
yeah, I mean, everyone has to approach that differently, at least from a practitioner standpoint or like a friend to friend standpoint or woman to woman standpoint. I think the way I approach it is just explaining how it works and trying to, use a more educational type of model. And then it's not my responsibility actually if someone chooses to do that or not. I feel like where my responsibility is just on providing a little more education around what it actually is and helping women to understand like you are actually trading your life force energy for the possibility, we could say, of conception. The thing is like when we conceive a child, we are always offering something, right? But the idea is when we're doing that in a physiological way that's like integral to our already reproductive life, that we receive a lot in return, right? We receive a lot from that exchange. And with IVF, you give, I think, more than you receive because you literally are trying to give more eggs because you need higher chances, right? You need to make sure there's enough eggs to keep trying. If one implantation fails, you can go back and get another one. So it does get complex. And then that's not even getting into like how, follistim or gonalef or some of these other IVF medications impact the way your brain functions, right? And we don't even know, like, what does that mean for long-term ovulatory patterns or even just neuroendocrine function overall, right? So that goes even outside of just reproduction, but it's like, how is our brain wired and how do these medications potentially shift that in a particular direction?
That's a great point. Yeah. Ooh. Okay. Well, one more thing that came to mind that I wanted to mention earlier was that I've heard the case for like you mentioned the disconnection and the like obviously the downsides. Like how could you pose the question like how could people think that children made in a lab would be the same, have the same health outcomes as a natural conception? But I've actually heard people say, like, some of the pro industry talking points of like, no, but you can vet out disease, or I have this genetic mutation in my family and I'm worried I would not want my kid to have this and that, so I can actually hand select the
Mm-hmm.
embryos. Like, people think that they're actually going to get the healthiest, they're told they're going to get healthier children this way because they can tease out one or two potential genetic
Yeah.
mutations.
I think then you're getting into like, again, you get more into the spiritual territory of what are the values that are kind of driving people's lives. And that sometimes you're just not going to penetrate in a way. of, okay, we just have to agree to disagree kind of situation. But I think still, like, and with those particular, with people that have that particular point of view or are making that argument, I still think there's quite a bit of research, like if you're into that, that points out or highlights at least that long term, I mean, would you want your child to have an increased risk of these other potential issues, developmental delays, allergies, asthma, even childhood cancers?
Yes.
Like, is that better than like a potential genetic disease that's been passed through your family? I don't know. It's like one of those questions that I don't know if there's a real solution or answer. We're all taking risks all the time. Like, I think a lot of times what that kind of stuff comes down to is risk mitigation. People really want to ensure the future or ensure a certain outcome, but that's not how life works, right? That's not the nature of reality that we're living in. Life is you can either look at life as inherently safe or inherently risky. Both are true at the same time. And we all have to be comfortable, I guess, with what kind of risks we're taking. And so for me personally, the risk of interfacing with that industry or going that route would be more than I was willing to take on. So yeah. And then sometimes people will come at me and be like, well, you have 3 kids. Like, it's easy for you to say, right? Because you never had to face that reality of not being able to conceive. And I recognize that. And I think that puts me in a very particular place in regards to the work I do. It gives me like a healthy distance from it in a way. I'm not teaching or sharing from a place of my own pain points or trauma, which is unique. And at the same time, it's like, of course, we all have different life experiences. That's just how it is. And you can choose to still remain rooted and oriented to your own value system and what is going to be actually in alignment for you. And I think that's the piece where I know so many women, it is out of alignment for them to go with ART, but they haven't really sat down, slowed down enough to tune in to what is like the undercurrent of that desire, right? Because the desire, yes, the desire for a child can kind of guide you in a lot of different directions. But I think the primal desire to have a child is really the desire to interface with your own vitality and to interface with your own creative potential. And that is pretty vast if we think about it. And that potential to uncover that, I think that is what's keeps me kind of doing the fertility work, is because some women will wake up to that. Not everyone, not in the timeline we might want, but some women really will. Like, they will get it. They will have maybe an unfortunately bad experience with IVF, or they will just dip their toes in and be like a no, or they will, never step into that model because they are rooted in themselves and their own desire to tap into their own creative potential.
It's so beautifully said. Will you tell us about the class you have coming up and who it's for?
Yeah. So I had reached out to you because I know we're offering like some very complimentary things coming up. So I have a workshop I'm teaching on August 5th that is called Restoring Fertility and Ovarian Vitality. So it's for women who are on the path to conception and maybe having some challenges, especially women who are maybe 40 or above 40 and still wanting to conceive, women who have been told they're infertile, women who maybe have tried ART and don't want to continue, or know that they're a no to ART. So they really are clear that they don't want to use ART and they don't know what other options they have, right? Because I think there is a particular current where it's like, well, if assisted reproductive technology isn't working, like, what else am I going to do situation? So we'll be diving into like some of the most common causes of infertility that I see in my practice, and where to go from here. So creating kind of like a 90-day plan to help women restore their fertility and really nourish their ovarian vitality.
Amazing. Oh, that sounds like such a fantastic offer. And I didn't ask you this earlier, but in your trainings and education, did you ever get any education that was critical of IVF or surrogacy, ART, or did you just kind of come to everything as you were seeing, like in the field, kind of in your practice?
Yeah, I kind of came to it like in my own experience and practice, but definitely no. I mean, so when I went to school for Chinese medicine, of course, I had some training around women's health and reproductive, specializing in reproductive medicine, but it was not through the lens of understanding reproductive technology. All of that education I kind of did on my own time and terms and through various avenues. So yeah, that, and a lot I learned from my mentor, Megan Joyce, who I worked with for several years in Orange County, California. And she had been in the ART community or fertility acupuncture community. And we just had a lot of conversations about it and what she had seen and what I had seen. And just, yeah, that whole industry, like really understanding it from the inside out.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Kristen. I love the work that you're doing and that you're really offering like the antidote for women to try something else, to move through something else.
Yeah.
And as you said, perhaps be like an usher or a mirror for that moment of realization where they may not be in alignment with the path that has been we've been conditioned to, or that has been laid out for us by the medical model. So thank you for your time. And I'm going to link your upcoming August 5th class in the show notes, and everyone should take both. You're going to need to know the ethics, then you need to know the what's next. So anyone who is considering, going down the route, as you said, who's perhaps struggling with their fertility, has had complications with ART, or isn't sure that there's even hope for them outside of that. Yeah, I'm excited to put these offerings out in the world for women to come to. And is your class recorded if people can't come live?
Yeah, it'll be recorded if you can't come live. I'm doing a Q&A at the end. And so I've hosted some workshops before, so I always stay on for the full Q&A. So if you're there and you can make it live, that'd be great. If you purchase and you want to submit a question beforehand, you can do that as well. So yeah, there will be options to get feedback.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kristen.
Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or family member who needs to hear this content. And if you do share it on social media, don't forget to follow and tag me at Whose Body Is It? So until next time.